Hello my crafty friends, in this video I'm going to show you how to make the Mallory Mini Crossbody Bag, my newest sewing pattern and one I'm really excited to share with you. The idea for this bag actually came from combining two different projects I made in the past. I loved certain elements from both, so I decided to blend them together. That's how this bag was born. It's always fun when a new design comes together like that. To make this adorable bag, you will need to purchase the pattern on my website. You can find a direct link in the description box below. The Mallory Mini Crossbody Bag has a really compact but clever design. It features front flap with a press lock closure and 3 pockets for your cards tucked neatly underneath, plus a hidden back pocket that is super secure, which is perfect for your mobile phone. Inside, it's fully lined and big enough to keep your sunglasses, small wallet and keys. There is also an adjustable crossbody strap with those beautiful contrasting connectors, which I absolutely adore. This is my new favorite adjustable strap. And what I love about this design is that it is unisex. So depending on what fabric you go for, this design works for anybody. And since the size is very compact, is just right for all the essentials, it's perfect for days when you don't want to carry too much, but still want to look put together. If you want to learn how to make your own Mallory Mini Crossbody Bag, then grab your supplies and let's get started. To make your bag, you will need external and lining fabric. Today I'm using this beautiful faux leather on the exterior portion of my bag, and for the lining I decided to use waterproof canvas. However, you can use various different types of fabrics to make your Mallory bag. Anything from cork, vinyl, wax cotton, quilting cotton, cotton canvas, or even upholstery fabric will work fantastic. Since I've chosen more of a medium weight fabric today and both of them have enough structure, I don't really have to worry about adding interfacing or stabilizer to my bag. Plus, I want to create more of a softer sloucher bag today. However, depending on what type of fabric you are working with, you may want to consider adding one or both of those options. So for example, if you are working with something like quilting cotton, which normally is quite lightweight, sometimes even has a little bit stretch, I would highly recommend fusing woven interfacing to the back of the fabric first. The same goes for fabric that has a tendency to fraying a lot. Even though this fabric is more of a medium weight, every time I use it, I always interface the back of the fabric first, because when I cut out my pattern pieces, this fabric just frays like crazy. So to prevent that from happening, adding woven interfacing to the back of the fabric is a great choice. If your fabric still looks and feels very lightweight and drapey, even though you've added woven interfacing to the back of the fabric, like I've done on this quilting cotton, then you can add stabilizer to your bag just to make it a little bit more structured. My favorite stabilizer is fusible fleece. This works beautifully on this type of fabric, especially because you can quilt it. I really like this look. But because fusible fleece is more of a lightweight, medium weight stabilizer, depending on the type you're going to buy or you're going to use, it produces more of a softer sloucher look. So if you want to create more structured bag, then I would go for something more medium weight like Decoville Light or foam stabilizer. To make your bag, you will need to cut 4 strap connectors from non-fraying fabric. You will also need 2 side panels from external fabric, but make sure to cut them as mirror images. So if you place them right sides together, you can see they are the exact same shape. Otherwise, you're going to end up with 2 right or 2 left pieces. So either place your fabric right sides together and then place your pattern piece on top and cut both of those pieces at the same time. Otherwise, if you don't like to fold your fabric, you can place your pattern on top, cut one piece, then flip the pattern piece to the back and then trace the other piece. You will also need to cut 1 gusset from external fabric and 1 from your lining fabric, 1 D-ring connector from external fabric, 1 main panel from external fabric, and then 2 from your lining fabric. This is going to be the back external piece and then front and back lining piece. You will also need to cut 1 flap from external fabric and 1 from your lining fabric. And depending on which fabric you are using, you're going to cut either 1 card pocket from external fabric. This is woven fabric. Make sure to use more lightweight fabric because you're going to fold it to create your card pockets. So this can create a little bit more bulk along those seams. So I prefer always to use more lightweight fabric that isn't too thick. However, if like me you are working with non-fraying fabric such as cork, vinyl or faux leather, you're going to follow version 2 to make your card pockets. So for that you will need to cut 1 top panel from your non-fraying fabric, 1 bottom panel from your non-fraying fabric, and then 2 front pocket pieces from your non-fraying fabric. You will also need 1 tongue lock or press lock for the closure. I like to use the smaller ones for this bag. So they are about 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch wide, no more than that. And mine comes with a washer and 2 tiny screws. So I have my screwdriver ready as well. Then to create our adjustable strap, you'll need 2 D-rings, 2 swivel hooks, 1 slider or strap adjuster, 1 rectangle ring, your webbing, and then we'll need a couple of rivets and tools to set them in. So I have my hole puncher and my hand press ready as well. And to make life easier, you may want to have a fabric glue or multi-surface glue ready as well. And also, depending on the type of fabric or webbing you are working with, you may want to use fray check glue in some areas as well. Once you've cut out all your pattern pieces and you interfaced and you stabilize them accordingly, then make sure to mark all your midpoints and the press lock placement on the wrong side of the fabric. But the fold lines and notches on the card pocket, if you are making the version 1 with woven fabric, must be marked on the right side of the fabric. So make sure to use a removable pen or a chalk so you can easily erase it. If you don't want to draw the entire fold line like I've done, then you can mark just the end. So you are marking notches inside the seam allowance. But because my fabric is quite busy, I want to make sure that you can see exactly how I'm folding it. I used a chalk and I drew my fold lines. And I also have my notches, but they aren't really visible that much. But I will hopefully be able to show you exactly what to do during the construction. I've marked the placement of my press lock on the wrong side of the fabric, but I actually forgot to stabilize this area. Whenever I'm working with very lightweight fabric like quilting cotton, I like to fuse Decovil Light or a similar stabilizer to the bag. So I'm going to do that off camera later on. If you are making version 2, because you are using non-fraying fabric, then also transfer the fold line on the bottom panel and your front pocket pieces to the right side of the fabric. But again, the press lock placement can be transferred and marked on the wrong side. If you aren't sure exactly how to transfer this T marking to the wrong side of the fabric, I'll show you what I like to do. So I already marked mine, but what you want to do is to fold the pattern along the top edge of that T letter. So just like that, and create a crease in the pattern, in the paper. Then you can place the pattern on top, making sure all the edges are aligned, and then flip this piece along that folded crease, and then you can use the edge of that folded piece of paper to mark the top edge of that T marking. And then since you've got your midpoints marked, you can use them to draw the other line, just to create that T letter. So this is how I like to do it, so I don't have to cut out my pattern. If you are making version 1 of your card pockets, then grab your piece and fold it with wrong sides together along the first fold line. So I have my line marked here. So what you want to do is to fold your fabric wrong sides together like this. Then take it to the pressing station and press it nice and flat, just like that. So this is what it looks like. So now you can take this to the machine and top stitch along this folded edge. To make the first pocket, what you want to do is to bring this folded edge and line it up at notches N1. So I have one here and one here. So right sides are facing each other. You're going to bring this folded edge and line it up at those two notches, just like that. Make sure your side edges are straight. You don't want to place your fabric at an angle, otherwise your pockets will be wonky and they may not be usable. So make sure everything is nice and straight. If you want, you can use a couple of clips to hold the top of the pocket. And what I like to do is to lift this fabric and press the pocket underneath so it is nice and flat. Just like that. Then we're going to do the second pocket. So to create second pocket, you're going to fold your fabric wrong sides together along the fold line number 2. So bring your fabric wrong sides together like this. Again, make sure side edges are nice and straight, and then you can press the top edge with an iron. Then again, we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to top stitch along that folded edge. Here we go, just like that. Then you're going to line up this edge at notches N2. So I have them marked here and here. So right sides together, you're going to line up this folded edge at those two notches. I'm going to move my clips so they can hold all the layers. Again, make sure your sides are nice and straight. Then lift the fabric and press the pocket underneath, just like that. And then you're going to do exactly the same thing to create the last pocket. So I have my fold line number 3. So fold your fabric wrong sides together along that line. Keep these side edges nice and straight. Press your fabric. Then take it to the machine and top stitch along that folded edge. And to create the last pocket, bring this folded edge and line it up at notches and 3. So I have them here and here. So again, right sides together, you're going to fold your fabric like that. Line up this edge, making sure everything is straight. I'm going to move my clips to hold that last pocket. So now I can lift the fabric and press the pocket underneath. Here you go. Or you can simply flip it over to the back and just press it flat. Just like that. Now I'm going to show you the second version. So grab your bottom panel and 2 of your front pocket pieces and then fold your pieces along the folded line, wrong sides facing each other. So let me show you. So you're going to take your piece, then fold it like so, wrong sides together, and then top stitch along that edge. And then you're going to do that for those 2 front pocket pieces as well. So you're going to fold the top edge like so, and then top stitch along that edge. So if you want, you can apply double-sided tape. This might be a little bit easier. So if you remove the plastic cover, then you can fold that edge and then press it with your fingers so it sticks and you have a nice straight edge, and you're going to do that for both pieces. Now that you have your pieces prepped, what you want to do is to grab your front pocket pieces and measure 7.5 centimeters from the top edge and then draw a line on both of those pieces. So this is exactly what I'm going to do now. So measure 7.5 centimeters and then draw a line just like that. Again, you are marking the right side of the fabric. So if you need to, use a removable pen or chalk so you don't have to worry about those markings being visible. Here we go. Next, you're going to take your top panel and place one of your front pockets on top. Line up the side edges and then align the line that you previously marked about 5 millimeters away, 1/4 of an inch away from that bottom edge. So if you want to mark another guideline for yourself, do that. So measure about 5 millimeters away from the bottom edge and then line up this line along the guideline, just like that. Use a couple of clips to hold it in place. Here we go. Then we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to sew the pocket across following this guideline, and then we're going to base the side edges. So next you're going to take your other front pocket and place it on top. Again, right sides are facing up. What you want to do now is to make sure the top edge of your lower pocket is 2 centimeters down from the top edge of your top pocket. So sometimes, depending on how precisely you pressed the top edge or how precisely you actually cut out the fabric, you may end up having a little bit more or a little bit less of the fabric here. So I drafted the pattern pieces so they should sit like this. So the top edge of your second pocket should technically be aligned along those two shorter edges. But like I mentioned, just in case, if this is not 2 centimeters, you can go back and maybe recut it if you need to. So I didn't cut it really precisely, so I would have to make it more straight. Otherwise you're adding extra bulk, and the reason we are using this alternative method is to reduce the bulk along those two side edges. So make sure everything is as precise as possible. So what I'm going to do is to keep my ruler on top, just like that. So I can place the second pocket on top. Keep everything nice and straight. I'm going to use a couple of clips to hold it along the sides. Here you go. And again, we're going to take this to the machine. We're going to use this line as a guideline to sew the seam. So if I flip this, you should have enough fabric underneath to catch the first pocket. If you don't have enough fabric, it means that you folded your top edge too much. So you're going to have to redo it. Otherwise, your pockets will not be as deep as they should. So what you want to do now is to take this to the machine, sew the seam along this bottom line, and then baste your side edges. When you are ready, you're going to flip this panel over to the back. So you can see my stitching line is here and the actual edge of the fabric is here. So I have enough space. You should have at least 5 millimeters, a 1/4 inch space, as we did before. So now what you want to do is to take a ruler and measure 2 centimeters from that previous stitching line. So you should have the same amount of space between each pocket to ensure all those pockets are the same amount of depth. So I'm going to measure 2 centimeters from that previous stitching line, and again draw a little guideline just like that. Then what you want to do is to flip this to the front, then grab your bottom panel and place it on top with right side facing up. If you lift this fabric here, those two edges technically should align properly. But just in case, again, if you didn't fold the top edge properly, like very precisely to the last millimeter, or if you didn't cut the fabric as precisely as you should have, then those edges may not be aligned as precisely. But what you want to do is to keep the space between the middle pocket and the lower pocket at the same distance as the top pocket. So 2 centimeters between those two folded edges. So if you have to, take a ruler, measure it. I'm just going to eyeball it for now. Then grab a couple of clips to hold everything in place, like so. Make sure your sides are nice and straight. So if you have to use your grid line to double check, do that. I'll need to move the bottom panel slightly because I can see it is a little bit wonky. Here we go, that's better. So next we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to tack our bottom panel just along the top edge. So don't sew over across the sides. If you do, then you will not be able to install your press lock. So all you have to do is to tack it at the top just to keep it in place. Then when you have that stitched, you're going to flip this to the back, move this piece out of the way, and then we're going to use this line as a guideline to close the bottom pocket. Now that our pockets are prepped, we can install the back plate of our press lock. So I have a separate video tutorial that will walk you through step by step how to do it. Otherwise, if you know how to do it, simply use your markings to install the back plate of your press lock. Now that you have your back plate installed, you can bring your pockets down or refold them if you have to. Then baste the side edges together. After that, you need to trim the height of that panel to the same height as your side panel, or simply measure 22 centimeters from the bottom edge. So you want to keep this portion of your panel as it is, and you want to trim away any excess along the top. So what I like to do is to take my side panel, place it next to it, and then I can mark how much I need to trim it off. So then I'm going to take my ruler now and making sure everything is straight and symmetrical, I'm going to draw a line across, just like that. Just double check if it matches the other side panel. Yeah. And now I can trim off that excess. There you go, just like that. Now you can grab your side panels and line them up on top of your pockets with right sides together, just like that. Clip everything together. If you want, you can take this to the machine now and sew the seam. However, I'm going to do that for both side panels at the same time. So I'm going to clip my other panel on the other side of the pockets. Here we go. So now I can take this to the machine and sew those two seams at the same time. Here we go, just like that. Then you're going to take this to the pressing station if you can. Open the panels and then press the seam allowance away from your pockets. So the seam allowance is facing the side panels, just like that. So you're going to press those two seams nice and flat. Then you can take this to the machine and simply top stitch along those two finished seams. If you are adding stabilizer to your bag, then now it's the time to add it to the front panel. Since we had to first assemble the front panel, you couldn't really apply it beforehand. So if you are adding stabilizer, either fuse it to the back of the fabric or baste it around all sides. Now you can take your external and lining flap pieces, because we're going to prep and sew our flap. Just so you know, this panel is actually the flap and the back pocket as one longer piece. So we are going to sew this panel in two different steps. So before we actually do that, what I like to do is to make my life a little bit easier, and I draw my stitching line, because there are tiny curves along those sides here and the bottom edges, and I want to make sure my stitching is actually as precise as possible. So what I do is to print another copy of my flap pattern piece, and I cut it without the seam allowance. So I use the dotted line on my pattern as a guideline, as a template. This is also a great way if you want a separate template for your stabilizer. If you are using, let's say, fusible stabilizer and you want to reduce the bulk at the seams, I always recommend to use the dotted line as a guideline for that. So now what I'm going to do is to center that template on top, making sure everything is straight. And I'm going to simply draw my stitching line on the wrong side of the fabric, just to make my life as easy as possible. So now what you can do is to take your other piece. So I marked the lining because the back of my external fabric is a little bit fluffy, so it's harder to mark. But you can mark whichever, just make sure you do it on the wrong side of the fabric. So now place those two pieces right sides together, line them up. You can use clips or pins to hold everything together. Here we go. Next, we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to sew the flap. So you are not sewing those straight edges. You are only focusing on the flap. So we're going to start here, sew the seam around the flap, and then we're going to end here. What I like to do is to reduce the stitch length around those curved corners. So if you want, you can keep slightly longer stitching along those straight edges, but to make sure those corners are as precise and as smooth as possible, it's always best to reduce the stitch length. So this is exactly what I'm going to do now. Once you've got this entire seam stitched, what you can do is to take pinking shears or scissors and then trim the seam allowance. So what I like to do is to trim the seam allowance around those corners closer to the stitching line, especially if I'm using fabric like waterproof canvas or faux leather that I know it doesn't fray much. I can get closer to the stitching line. If you don't have pinking shears, you can cut a little V-shape out of the seam allowance. This will allow the fabric to lay nice and flat when you turn your flap right side out. But since I have pinking shears, I'm going to use them to trim my seam allowance. If your fabric has a tendency to fraying a lot, you may need to leave a little bit more of a seam allowance. So don't get too close to the stitching line. Otherwise, when you turn your flap and you push those corners out, your fabric actually can rip. So just do a little test run on a scrap of fabric, or you can interface or stabilize or use fray check glue at the edges just to prevent them from fraying. Here we go, just like that. So now we can turn our flap right side out. Here we go. What I like to do is to use my corner shaper just to push out those corners. I run it along the seam as well. So next you can take this to the pressing station and simply press the seam nice and flat. What you can do is to roll the fabric between the fingers to bring the stitching to the top. This will create very nice, straight and smooth seam. As you can see, as a last minute decision, I decided to actually stabilize my flap, because after I turned the fabric right side out, the flap was a little bit too floppy for my liking. So I want my bag to be soft and slouchy, but I didn't want the flap to be too soft. And after some consideration, I decided to add Decovil Light to add just enough structure to my flap so the flap doesn't flop around. And as you can see, I actually didn't apply the Decovil Light to the entire fabric. I only focus on the flap portion because I don't need extra stability along the back pocket. So if this is something you wanted to try, you can do that. Experiment with different stabilizer, with different placement, and see what works for you. You know, some portions you may need to stabilize more or less depending on the type of fabric you are using, or you may need to omit stabilizer altogether depending on the fabric you are using. So just play with it, just see what works for you. And when you are ready, you're going to take this to the machine and top stitch along that finished seam. The flap is now prepped. So now what you can do is to baste the external and lining fabric along the back pocket. So later when we're going to stitch it to the main panel, the fabric doesn't shift. So this is exactly what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to baste the back pocket around those three sides. Now you can take your external main panel and place your flap with the back pocket on top, just like that. So as you can see, the right sides are facing up. You want to match your midpoints along the bottom edge and clip them together, like so. Then you will notice that the side edges do not align. The side edges on our back pocket are wider than the main panel, but don't worry, this is intentional. So what you're going to do now is to bring those edges and align them with the main panel. You're going to have to do that one side at a time. So just take your time, clip that in place. Then you're going to do that on the other side as well. Here we go. Next, we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to baste our pocket to the main panel. What I like to do is to actually sew it from this side so I can follow the shape of my back panel, of my main panel, because we've got curves along the corners and I like to baste it as one long seam. Now that we have our pocket basted, you can trim the corners using the main panel as a guideline. So all you want to do is to trim off those corners. Now you can take your external gusset and your front panel and place it on top just like that. So you should have midpoints marked in the center of your gusset and also in the center of your front panel. So match them up just like that. Use pins or clips to hold the fabric together. And then you're going to line up the gusset along the side edges. So start at the top, line up the top edge like so, and clip those two pieces together. Then when you get to the corner, what you might have to do is to snip the gusset into the seam allowance so it's easier for you to line up the edges. Because this allows the fabric to kind of spread, as you can see, and it is much easier to line up the straight edge of the gusset along those curved corners. So clip those two pieces together and then do that on the other side as well. So again, I like to start from the top and then go down. When I get to the corner, I can snip my gusset. And then line up those edges. Like so. So now you can take this to the machine and sew the seam. Once you've got the seam stitched, you can take your pinking shears or scissors and trim the seam allowance, especially around those curved corners. So I usually just trim it along the bottom edge. Just like that. I tend to leave full seam allowance along those straight edges. So now just double check if you are happy with everything. So I have two very small pleats, but they don't bother me, so I'm just going to leave it as it is. So next you're going to take your back panel with your flap and your pocket and line it up on the other side of the gusset. So again, make sure you have your midpoints so you can match them up. Mine actually disappeared, so I'm going to fold my panel and just snip the fabric so I know exactly where is my midpoint, so I can match them up. Clip your pieces together. Again, you're going to start at the top, so line up the top edges, your side edges, and clip those two pieces together. So next we're going to take this to the machine, and again we're going to sew the seam and trim the seam allowance around those bottom corners and the bottom edge, so the seam lays nice once you turn the bag right side out. Now we're going to prep our D-ring connector. So if you want, you can draw a line in the center on the wrong side of the fabric. Then if you cannot press your fabric, apply double-sided tape. Otherwise, you can take this to the pressing station. And what you're going to do next is to fold those longer edges towards the line in the center. So you are folding your edges wrong sides together, like so. Your raw edges should meet in the center on the back of the fabric. Then you're going to take this to the machine and top stitch along those two folded edges. Now you can fold the connector in half, like so. Then take scissors and cut it in half. So you want to create two smaller D-ring connectors. Now you can grab your D-rings and feed your smaller connectors through. Then fold your connector in half. So wrong sides, the sides with those raw edges, needs to face each other. Then you can clip those shorter edges like this. And you're going to do that for the other connector and your D-ring. Then we can take this to the machine and we're going to baste along those two shorter edges. Now you can take your finished bag, and what you want to do is to line up your connectors in the center of your gusset, but on the right side of the fabric. So you're going to have to squish your bag a little bit, then line up those shorter edges in the center of the gusset, like so. Clip that together, and then do that on the other side for the other connector. Now you can take this to the machine and baste your connectors to the gusset. Now you can take your lining pieces, so you should have two main panels, one front, one back, and then gusset, and assemble them in exactly the same way you've done the external pieces. So first you're going to grab one of your main panels and your gusset, place them right sides together, line up the midpoints, clip those two pieces together. Then you can line up the gusset around the sides. When you get to the corners, if you have to, snip the gusset into the seam allowance, so it's easier for you to line up the edges. Then take this to the machine and sew the seam. Then trim the seam allowance by half again. Next, you can take your back lining piece and line it up on the other side of the gusset. Here we go. Then you're going to take this to the machine one more time and sew the seam. However, this time we need to leave an opening somewhere along the seam, so later we can turn the entire bag right side out. So I actually like to leave an opening along the straight edge, so along one of those side seams. So I'm going to mark a couple of notches so I don't forget it. You want to leave as big opening as possible so you can turn the bag right side out. If you leave too small opening and your fabric is very sturdy and you use stabilizer, then you're going to struggle a lot. So it is best to leave larger opening. So now I'm going to take this to the machine and I'm going to sew the entire seam, leaving a large gap so I can turn my bag. Now you can trim your seam allowance. What I like to do is to leave full seam allowance along the opening. So depending on where you actually left the opening, it's much easier to close the seam later if you have full seam allowance. So that's exactly what I've done. Now you can turn your lining right side out, just like that. Then grab your external bag and place the lining inside. So you'll have to place the flap inside your bag. You want to keep it out of the way. Then place your lining into the bag. Line up your seams, line up the top edge, and then you can clip everything together. What I also like to do is to press the seam allowance in opposite direction. So on the exterior, I press in one direction, and then on the lining, I press it in the other direction, just to reduce the bulk. You can also trim the seam allowance slightly if you wish, but it really depends on what type of fabric you are working with. So you're going to go around the entire edge and clip the lining to the external part of your bag. Also make sure to keep your connectors out of the way. You don't want to catch them. So just pay attention to that. Here we go. So this is what it should look like. So now that you have everything clipped or pinned together, you can take your bag to the machine and simply sew the seam along that top edge. Now that you have your seam stitched, you can pull out the lining and then turn your bag right side out for the opening in the lining. Push out those corners, your gusset, make sure your seams are nice and rounded. You want to insert the lining back into your bag. Then, if you can, take your bag to the pressing station and press the top edge nice and flat. So what I like to do again is to roll the fabric between my fingers to bring the stitching line to the top and then press it nice and flat. Since I cannot really press my fabric, I'm going to use clips to just hold that in place. But before I do that, I want to mention something. Depending on the type of machine you are using, it might be actually easier to sew from the inside out. So what I prefer is to actually flip the entire bag inside out. So when I'm at the machine, you're going to have to tuck that flap inside as well, because when I'm at the machine I actually prefer to stitch from the external fabric, so I can see my stitching on the exterior of my bag. I want to make sure the stitching is as precise and as neat as I can on the exterior of my bag. I don't really worry too much about the lining because nobody really sees it. But I want to make sure the stitching on the outside of my bag is as neat as possible. So I actually prefer to stitch it from this side. So what I'm going to do now is to use clips to just keep that top edge in place while I'm stitching. So I'll do that, and then I'm going to take this to the machine and simply top stitch around this top edge. If you have to, turn your bag right side out one more time. This is what it looks like on my bag. Pretty neat top stitching, I must say. So now all we have to do is to close the opening in the lining. So pull out your lining, fold under the seam allowance, and then you can pin or clip those two folded edges together, like so. Here we go. If you want, you can take this to the machine now and simply top stitch very close to that folded edge, making sure you catch both pieces. Otherwise, to create a nicer finish, more of a neat finish inside, you can close the opening by hand using a ladder stitch. And that's exactly what I'm going to do, because I don't like the seam sticking out on one side. Otherwise, every other seam looks really nice and neat, and that one seam kind of sticks out. So I actually prefer to close this tiny opening by hand. Put the lining back into your bag and then install the other part of your press lock. Give your bag a final press if you have to, otherwise this project is now finished. Well done! I have a separate video tutorial that will show you how to make the adjustable strap, so go check it out if you need help. Otherwise, you can attach the strap to your finished bag, and now you can enjoy your very own Mallory Mini Crossbody Bag. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed making your own version of this pattern. Let me know if you've got any questions below, and I hope to see your version somewhere on social media. So make sure to tag me at Allsewpetite on Instagram, Facebook and TikTok. Otherwise, I see you in the next video. Stay crafty, friends. Bye!